Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Breaking Convention, Star Wars Original Trilogy versus the prequels. So, Breaking Convention is a new series I'll be doing to express an opinion on film that goes against popular opinion or the majority opinion that is overwhelmingly expressed on the internet. Breaking Convention is not likely to win me more subscribers and is probably more likely than not to gain more dislikes than likes. However, I'm not doing Breaking Convention to win any popularity contest. I'm doing it to express an opinion I and others share that seldom gets heard because it is often drowned out on the internet by the opposing opinion. A saying I was always quite fond of was, just because something is popular doesn't mean it's correct. And so I'm here not only to express opinions, but to back them up and explain why I and others may feel this way, and even though they may be in the minority, they are still valid. So this video in particular is about the original Star Wars trilogy versus the prequel trilogy. Now, the popular way of thinking, expressed relentlessly over the internet, is that the original trilogy is better than the prequels. And not to worry, that is a notion I will not challenge here today because it is actually one in which I agree with, and I feel there's good reason why this is a majority opinion. However, the notion I do want to challenge is the degree in which the original trilogy is better than the prequel trilogy. That is, the notion that the original trilogy is a masterpiece and the prequel trilogy is total and complete shite. The thesis of this video is that the original trilogy isn't as flawless as it is made out to be, and the prequels aren't as flawed comparatively as everyone makes it out to be. And ultimately, nostalgia is a huge factor in why this opinion is so overwhelmingly dominant. So, I first got the idea for this video a few years back when I joined in a conversation in which several people in their late teens and early 20s were having about the upcoming Star Wars movies directed by J.J. Abrams, in which one of them suggested they were going to be crap. However, I countered that perhaps what the Star Wars saga needed was some new blood, since George Lucas had proved himself to be not very effective director. To which the young person in question countered with, well, yeah, he only created the whole Star Wars saga in the first place, why would you want him involved? To which I countered with, yeah, and he also did the prequels, which he ruined. Then this young man proceeded to tell me that the prequels were better than the original trilogy and only hipsters felt otherwise, and that it was a very hipster thing to do to put down the prequels. I was actually really taken aback by this statement, which none of the other young people present challenged. I then explained that I actually liked the prequels more than most people, as Revenge of the Sith was one of my favorite Star Wars movies, but I still thought the statement that it was a hipster thing to say that the originals were better than the prequels was pretty outrageous. But he stood behind his statement, stating that The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones were far better than people gave them credit for. So, I still totally disagree with that statement, but it got me thinking about how the opinions on the two trilogies could vary due to which generation one belongs to. Those who are in my generation who grew up in the 80s would have more of an attachment to the original trilogy, whereas those belonging to the young generation that grew up in the 90s and early 2000s may have more of an attachment to the prequels. And from his perspective, those of his generation who favor the original trilogy do so because they have been told repeatedly to do so by the older generation, making it a hipster or cool thing to do. But as I said, I do think that objectively speaking, regardless of which generation you belong to, the original trilogy is better than the prequel trilogy, and here are some reasons why. Number one, the movies in the original trilogy are more self-contained. Although they all contribute to the whole, each film has its own beginning, middle, and end and can be fully enjoyed on its own, whereas it feels in the prequels the first two films are more setups for the third film and ultimately aren't really that necessary for the overall story and are just there to set up the third film. Number two, better and more dynamic characters. The chemistry between the main characters, Han, Luke, and Leia really worked really well, as well as the sidekicks Chewbacca, R2-D2, and C-3PO, and the villains like Darth Vader and many other side villains like Jabba the Hutt and the Emperor all worked well and helped tell a great story, whereas the camaraderie between the characters in the prequels didn't work nearly as well. Qui-Gon was a good character but killed off in the first movie, and because of this they had to try to create new character dynamics that didn't take hold until the third movie, and Jar Jar Binks was an utter failure, and with the exception of the Emperor, all the villains were two-dimensional, uninteresting, and added nothing to the film. Number 3, each film in the original trilogy was better constructed. Each film had a perfect 3-act structure and felt like an adventure film where they go on separate exciting adventures and meet back in the end, whereas the prequels were filled with a lot of slow pace and extraneous storylines that added nothing to the overall plot of the film. And there are many other reasons as well, such as the overuse of CGI in the prequels and whatnot. But to me, those are the 3 main reasons. So now that I hopefully thoroughly explained that I felt the original trilogy was better than the prequels, let me get to my thesis that the prequels aren't as bad as the common pop culture would have you believe. I went on YouTube looking for reviews on the prequels, and predictably, most of them were about how much they sucked. I did find a few that tried to point out positive attributes, but even those videos I feel were being a bit more negative than I would. And then I saw a few YouTubers who had responded to those positive videos, retorting that there was absolutely nothing positive about them at all. And personally, I found those videos rather pointless. It's kind of like someone making a video about how great it is to get a blowjob or how much they'd love to eat chocolate. Those are pretty common opinions. You're not going to be very original or new by stating a popular opinion almost everyone agrees with, so what's the fucking point? Whereas if you point out the positives on something that's become hip to make fun of, that's actually a bit more worthwhile. So, to illustrate my point, let me begin by citing some negative reviews from critics about the prequels. Here's a review from 2002 about Star Wars Episode II Attack of the Clones from New York Times critic Vincent Canby. I'm not as bothered by the film's lack of resolution as I am about my suspicion that I really don't care. After one has one's fill of the special effects, and after one identifies the source of the facetious banter that passes for wit between Anakin Skywalker and Padme, it's straight out of a B-picture comedies of the 30s, there isn't a great deal for the eye or mind to focus on. Hayden Christensen has a cheerful, nondescript as one would wish a comic strip hero to be, and Miss Portman as a sexlessly pretty has the base of a porcelain lamp. Become, is it rude to say, tiresome. One finally looks around them, even through them, at the decor. So, that's probably the kind of review you'd expect about Attack of the Clones. Oh wait, hold on. It seems I've made a mistake. This was actually a review from 1980 about The Empire Strikes Back. And that critic wasn't talking about Hayden Christensen as Anakin or Natalie Portman as Padme. Instead, he was talking about Harrison Ford as Han Solo and Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia. Sorry, my bad. Okay, well how about this quote from Judith Martin of the Washington Post that said this in 2002. The Attack of the Clones has no plot structure, no character studies, let alone character development, no emotional or philosophical point to make. It has no original vision of the future, which is depicted as a pastiche of other junk culture formulae such as the Western, the costume epic, and the World War II movie. Its specialty is special effects or visual tricks, some of which are played imaginative and impressive, but others which have become space movie cliches. So that too sounds like a reasonable complaint about Attack of the Clones. Oh, wait a second, looks like I made another mistake. That article again was from 1980 and was talking about The Empire Strikes Back, not The Attack of the Clones. Well then, how about what Pat Gibbs of The Telegraph said of these cheesy romance scenes between Anakin and Padme in Revenge of the Sith? The dialogue given to the lovers is laughable and their performance match it. So what is presumably intended as a great romantic finale comes to little, which might equally be said of the film as a whole. So, well, that does seem to match up with common consensus on the Anakin Padme romance. Oh, wait a second. Sorry, I did it again. That was actually an article from 1983 talking about the romance of Han Solo and Leia in Return of the Jedi. Well, okay, I think you get my point. Now, there's several things you may be saying to yourself at this point. First off is that's not really fair to cherry pick the few bad reviews of the original trilogy and present them as if they mean something. But in fact, the overall reception by critics of The Empire Strikes Back was described as mixed or lukewarm, and the critical response of The Return of the Jedi was even less positive, as even fans of The Empire Strikes Back turned on Jedi as a disappointment. And the other thing you may be saying is, well, those are just idiot critics. What the hell do they know? And indeed, I have said similar things myself in the past, stating that critics are useful to a point, but are no means the end-all, be-all of whether or not a movie is good. So their words shouldn't be taken as written in stone. But if you're going to have that attitude about what the critics say about the original trilogy, then you must approach what the critics said about the prequels with the same attitude, that they don't know everything and are not the keepers of whether it's truly good or not. Therefore, the fact that the prequels weren't received well by critics is just as meaningless as was the fact that the original trilogy wasn't received well by critics. But more to my point, and the main reason I bring up these reviews now, that any modern day and current reviews of the original trilogy would be much more favorable. On Rotten Tomatoes, which judges from a range of reviews all written within the past 5 years, has Star Wars at 94%, The Empire Strikes Back at 95%, and The Return of the Jedi at 79%. Whereas, had they been rated in a similar fashion upon the release, they would have likely received scores somewhere between 40 and 60%. So what's changed? Why the drastic shift in how critics view these films? Were their films somehow altered over this time? Well, there was the special editions in 1997 and a DVD release which altered them slightly, but those were mostly rejected by fans and critics alike, so it wasn't that. So if it wasn't the films themselves that changed, it must be the critics. Namely, the majority of the critics and people writing articles and making videos on the internet are likely to be in the age range of their 30s and 40s, and people who are of that age range when these films first came out were of a totally different generation. They grew up in the 50s and the 60s and saw Star Wars as something new and unfamiliar, whereas those in their 30s and 40s presently grew up in the 70s and 80s, right around the time the original Star Wars trilogy was huge. In short, they grew up their whole lives loving Star Wars and living with the original trilogy, and thus looking at it through the eyes of a child and growing an emotional attachment to them. Then comes along these new prequels that are silly and ugly with cheesy dialogue, overblown special effects, so of course they reject them outright and claim that the greedy studios are attempting to ruin their childhood by shitting all over the movies that they loved. While being ironically ignorant of the fact that people said the exact same things about the original trilogies that they are now saying about the prequels when they were first released. The common complaint about the prequels is that there's too much CGI and special effects. Critics said the same thing about the original trilogy, that it was all about dazzling audiences with special effects. They failed to focus on story. People cringe at the stiff acting and unrealistic dialogue between Anakin and Padme, not realizing critics reacted the exact same way between the dialogue and acting between Han and Leia. People make fun of and bash the ridiculous attempts to appeal to children with Jar Jar Binks, may be somewhat aware that critics and audiences alike acted the exact same way to the introduction of the Ewoks in 1983. The point being, nostalgia causes causes one to have a much more favorable view of the original material and look on new additions to that beloved material in a much more skeptical light. That is why the prequels play out much more favorably with younger audiences who grew up with the prequels, many who are quick to point out how much better the special effects are, how much more exciting the fighting sequences are, particularly the lightsaber fighting scenes. This one review I saw in particular that attempted to refute these claims by showing lightsaber scenes back to back and claiming that the original trilogy was more dignified and less choreographed, and then would show the romantic scenes between Han and Leia back to back with the romantic scenes between Anakin and Padme, claiming that the original was better. This reviewer, in my opinion, was most definitely looking at these comparisons through the dirty lenses of nostalgia, and many of those from a younger generation would not look at them in the same way. So, this past May the 4th, I celebrated it by watching 5 out of the 6 Star Wars movies. I had heard about something called the Machete Order, which I wanted to try, which is apparently where you watch A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, and then watch Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, and then go back and watch Return of the Jedi. The idea being you first get Luke's story, then Anakin's story, and then watch as the two come together. The Phantom Menace is skipped over entirely, which is fine by me because I really didn't like that film. At any rate, when I watched the original trilogy, I tried to look at it in a very objective light, which is hard for me to do because not only did I grow up with these films, but I've seen them like a billion times. But it's been several years since I watched them last, so I tried to do so in a new light. And I did notice that they weren't as perfect as they are made out to be in the modern times all over the internet. The original Star Wars is a bit formulaic, a bit melodramatic, with a lot of lines seemingly coming straight from a cheesy 1940s serial, and frankly, it did drag on quite a bit at the beginning. The Empire Strikes Back, while remaining one of my favorite movies of all time, I could see that the cheesy Lucas dialogue was there in the Leia and Han Solo scenes, which was pretty much just the obligated love interest that every movie must have, even though it doesn't really fit or make that much sense. And the Luke training scenes did seem to drag on a little bit, as did the Vader-Luke lightsaber fight, which wasn't nearly as exciting as the prequel fights. And Return of the Jedi, the Ewoks may not be as annoying as Jar Jar Binks, but they were damn close. It was utterly ridiculous how they managed to defeat a bunch of armed stormtroopers, and it was also silly how Lando was made a general and put in charge of destroying the Death Star, that we were following a character we barely knew. But I did notice a drastic drop in quality when Attack of the Clones came on. But that quality drop was lessened with Revenge of the Sith. But I do see how some of the magic was missing. It was funny because I watched the originals with my flatmate who was 21 years old and had never seen any Star Wars before in her life, and ultimately she didn't really care for it. And in particular, she thought the Yoda scenes in The Empire Strikes Back were ridiculous. She said, that to her it looked like Kermit the Frog, and we were expected to take him seriously, that some guy was talking to a Muppet, and she couldn't look past that. And I thought that was an interesting way to look at it, and once she mentioned it, I could certainly see it from her perspective. Even though we may now think that about CGI characters like Jar Jar Binks looking too cartoonish, those in modern times may think that the practical aliens of the past Star Wars looked like obvious puppets and are outdated. Those of us who grew up with them would have a hard time seeing them that way because we're used to them, but it's not too far-fetched to someone who has a different perspective. Now, all those videos I watched that try to give the prequels a little bit of credit and talk about what they did right would bring up details like the special effects, the backgrounds, the lightsaber fights, and how awesome the Emperor was portrayed, which I all agree with. But the main thing I would point to is that overall the prequels are smarter and present a much more realistic allegory for modern times than the original trilogy, which was a stereotypical, overly simplified view of good versus evil. In fact, watching the original trilogy again recently, I could see how obviously it was meant to parallel the American Revolution. They even went as far to give all the rebel American accents and all the Empire British accents, Alec Guinness and James Earl Jones being the exceptions to this. But the rest of them, all the evil Empire minions, all British. And of course, I found boiling even that war down to a simplistic view of good versus evil to be an oversimplifying things and not at all very dynamic storytelling. Whereas the prequel showed a vision that was much more complex, and it was about a young senator who worked his way up to Chancellor of the Galactic Senate, who was at the same time was instigating a war on both sides of the war in order to scare people into giving him more power. And once he gained all the power he needed, he ended the war, which was nothing but a farce in the first place, and declared himself the emperor, turning a democratic republic into an imperial dictatorship. A much more complex story, and Lucas could be quoted in the early 80s as making comparisons to the emperor to Richard Nixon. However, when Revenge of the Sith came out in 2005, during the Iraq War, obvious parallels were drawn between the Emperor and those in the Bush administration, and I personally felt it was spot on, and it's an allegory which was intelligent and important and brave, and was far more than what the simplistic good versus evil view of the original trilogy accomplished, which is why I view Revenge of the Sith as my second favorite Star Wars film, and it is in my top 20 of my overall favorite films, with those who've watched my top 50 favorite films would know that. So, for the record, my rating of the 6 Star Wars films is number 6, The Phantom Menace, number 5, The Attack of the Clones, number 4, A New Hope, number 3, Return of the Jedi, number 2, Revenge of the Sith, and number 1, The Empire Strikes Back. And I've seen other people on the net rank the Star Wars films in a lot of different versions and variations. And the one that has all 3 original films ahead of all 3 prequels are actually in the minority. I'd say most of them have Revenge of the Sith in the top 3. And of course, some of them even prefer The Phantom Menace or The Attack of the Clones over some of the original trilogies. So the opinion that the original trilogy isn't extremely superior to the prequels isn't that absurd, or a notion that is shared by more people than the internet critics would have us believe. As for the new trilogy that's about to come out, I do think it's possible it will be viewed on in a more favorable light than the prequels, because as I said, the prequels did contain many flaws, more so than the original trilogy. So if the new trilogy corrects these flaws, I'm sure Star Wars fans and critics would look on them more favorably. But they're never going to be seen as better or as good as the original Star Wars trilogy, regardless of how good they are, because no real modern day movie can compete with the fictional, nostalgia-driven image of a perfect masterpiece that most people from my generation have of the original Star Wars trilogy. So that's it for my breaking convention video on Star Wars. Be sure to check out my channel for many other reviews. I do reviews on Star Trek, Game of Thrones, and other shows and films, so be sure to subscribe to keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.